Hello, welcome to Archaeological. Today, in honor of President Biden's declaration of Indigenous Peoples Day as a national holiday, I've decided to make a video on how culturally sophisticated the American Indian cultures of the Eastern Woodlands, especially the American Southeast, were before and even during Columbian contact. Now, I know that a lot of videos have been done on the cultures such as the Maya and the Aztec and the Toltec and Inca and such, and even the southwestern cultures such as the Hohokam and the Hopi. And those are, very important videos as well because they were very advanced in their own right. However, with the exception of sites such as Cahokia, the Mississippian and other earlier woodland cultures of the American South and East have been often overlooked. And that's unfortunate. So I feel making this video is important to remedy that situation. So what I do, let's get started. Okay, so pre-Columbian cultures of the Southeast, a look at the cultural advancements and sophistication of pre-Columbian tribes. So how advanced were they and how early were they advanced? Well, very advanced, and I'd say very early. The first period we're going to look at is what is known as the Paleoindian Period. Now, most people hear Paleoindian or Paleolithic, and they think of, cavemen, big brutes, and stuff like that who live in caves and bonk women over the head with a club. And that couldn't be farther from the truth. Because, yes, I mean, they didn't live in cities and they didn't practice agriculture, but that doesn't mean anything. I mean, there are still hunter-gatherer people today. And they were, one of the longest spans of human history that we have. They go back almost 40,000 years. Recent news has even shown that there's a site in the Southwest that dates to the Southwestern United States that dates to around 23,000 years ago, which means that Paleo-Indians and American Indians were here between maybe 30,000 to 40,000 years ago. And it's not the first site. There are other sites in, say, Virginia that were dated 20,000 years ago. So Virginia's further east. So do the math of how long it took people to walk across. So they were probably here fairly early. And that in itself was an amazing accomplishment. So how advanced were the Paleo-Indian culture at that time? And like I said, fairly advanced. So as you see in this picture here, there's a figure with an atlatl. Now, atlatls are one of the longest lasting technological advancements of history. I mean, they're developed probably in Eurasia before the Paleo-Indians came across either through the Kelp Highway or the Bering Land Bridge. The ice-free corridor, because Bering Land Bridge is something a little bit different. But so it goes back, tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of years, but it lasts all the way up to contact with the Spanish and the French and British, and even further after. And I'll cover that a little bit more later. So they had this very accurate and advanced technological tool that they would often have what's called an atlatl dart. It looks like a long arrow. They'd have the edge of that hollowed out so that they could put an arrowhead attached to a stick in it, so that when they threw it at, say, a mammoth or a camel or a horse, that only the arrowhead would stay into the animal, so they could go and retrieve the atlatl dart itself and just put another arrowhead in, which is very ingenious. It's very practical. But so what other technology did they have? Well, they had quite a lot. Like I said, they had the atlatl, as you see in the bottom left corner, but they also had rather ingenious points designed. We've all heard of the Clovis point, but there are other points that you can see right here in the bottom right corner, all from the American Southeast. You know, very complex points designed to take down large animals. But not even just that. They had tools. They had little drills and cutting tools, but also tools called adzes or an adze. And for those of you who don't know, an adze is a tool that's used to strip the bark off of wood and also split and flatten the wood. And it's still even used by some woodworkers today. So it's, again, it's a very long-lasting technology. And so in the top left corner, excuse me, you can see a picture example of a Paleolithic picture and an artifactual example of a Paleolithic adze. So, you know, very advanced people, and they migrated into America very early and were advanced for their time. I mean, they were equivalent to Europe and Asia at the time. But of course, you know, once you stay in one place for a while, and after the animals, big animals started dying out, likely due to climate change, like, you know, the horses, camels, and mammoths that I mentioned, the myth that they were overhunted is just that, probably a myth, though. I mean, there's some debate about whether or not climate change, after climate change had thinned out and killed off a lot of the herds, the few remaining herds were left couldn't cope with the hunting that it is. I'm on the fence about that, so I'm not going to get into that conversation. I need to see more evidence in essence. But, you know, after these big animals started to die, something started to change, and that's what we call the Archaic Period. And, you know, there's not really any how to put this, there's not really any solid line or solid transition point between the Archaic Period and the Paleoindian Period, because while the Archaic Period saw construction of the first construction of mounds, such as Serpent's Mound up in Ohio, and Poverty Point in Louisiana, which is between 3,000 and 4,000 years old, so a very old mound. Not the oldest, but still among the oldest and among the largest of the archaic mounds. We do see them still practicing, you know, hunter-gatherer technology and hunter-gatherer subsistence methods. They didn't do agriculture at the time. But like I said, they did start building these mounds. And on the subject of Serpent's Mounds, sorry, people who watch Ancient Aliens, it is not an alien built battery or whatever they said. It's a ceremonial mound. Sorry, put that out of your heads. These were advanced people for the time, roughly on the same level as Mesolithic people in the Asia and Europe and Africa. I mean, you know, these could easily be, in fact, I would argue these are, you know, equivalent to Stonehenge and Woodhenge and other things. So no, not primitive people. People in Europe at around this time, roughly 8,000 years ago to 1,000 years ago, were still, you know, doing hunter-gatherer methods. And yes, 1,000 years ago is not when people in Europe and Asia were practicing hunter-gatherer methods. The Archaic Period goes for a long while, but in other parts of Asia, like Mongolia and the most northern parts of Europe, they still were, so it's still comparable. But they, you know, that's not the point. The point is they are comparable for the time. So what does the Archaic Period look like in terms of culture and technology? Well, you begin to see the development of pottery. Again, very similar to in Europe and the Middle East and Asia and Africa. You see this transition into development of practical tools for sedentary lifestyles. And one of those things is pottery. Now, it should be said that pottery has been found dating to 20,000 years or more in China. So pottery could have been invented earlier, but China, that seems to be, China at the time seems to be the exception to the rule, because we see literally no evidence for it before this period, in not just in the Americas, but also not in Mesopotamia, which is thought to be the fertile crescent of civilization, not in Europe, nowhere. We just see it in China. So China was the exception to the rule. So with that in mind, the Mesolithic and Archaic period of the U.S. Is where we begin to see the development of this pottery. And not just that, we see bone carving tools and needles and such up in the top right corner, and more small game-oriented points, such as a Savannah Creek points, which is the second one from the right on the bottom in the picture on the top left. But, it wasn't just that. We begin to see artwork as well. Among these is the not so aptly named Poverty Point objects on the left, and they're named that because they were found at the Poverty Point mounds. As one archaeologist put it, is because archaeologists are not so great at naming artifacts. I tend to disagree, but at the same time, the fact that these objects are named simply after the site isn't really helping my case. But that aside, they're still fascinating objects that nobody really quite knows what they are. Some are just game pieces. I mean, not all of them are always the same size or shape. So it could be they have a variety of uses. Nobody really knows, but they're still fascinating pieces of art developed at the time. And then on the right, we have what are called banner stones. And what these are, again, we don't really know. Multiple successful tests have been done on a variety of uses. One successful test showed they could be used as weights for fire starters. Another one showed that they could be used as weights for atlatl. So we don't really know, but there's, that doesn't change the fact that they're truly beautiful and intricately carved stone artifacts that had a use at the time. And no, they weren't aliens. I'm going to probably cover that a few times during this episode. It wasn't aliens. Just because we don't know what they were used for doesn't mean that it was aliens. And also that stereotype that, if archaeologists don't know it, it's a ritual, which isn't unfounded, but also completely true, isn't, what it is. We don't always assume it's religious. Sometimes we're just like, we don't know. We mentioned it could be ritual, but sometimes we're like, okay, they could have been used for fishing or who knows. So let's put that out of our minds too. It's not always ritual or religion. And in fact, I feel like that takes away from the accomplishments that they have to just assume that we assume that they're always ritual or religion, because we don't always make things for ritual or religion. And again, it could have been just art. We don't know. Sometimes we make things for no rhyme or reason. Even in our modern society. So, like I said, beautiful pieces of technology and art were made in this. So, and this is largely because while they still practice hunter-gatherer subsistence methods, they started to settle down in permanent villages. They haven't adopted agriculture yet, but that doesn't necessarily mean anything. And another thing that's a trademark of the time is we begin to see the development of an early trade network that probably did exist also in the Paleoindian period, but it wasn't quite as big, or at least as we know of. We have a lot of Paleoindian sites, but again, when they're mostly hunter-gatherer technology and hunter-gatherer subsistence methods, it's hard to determine things. We have found art, but it's like when most of them are points and animal bones. How it doesn't mean that they were any less technologically advanced, and I don't want anyone to think that I'm saying that. It's just sometimes the archaeological record only gives us so much, and we do account for that in papers. However, this trade network did begin to become to fruition in the Archaic period, and now it wouldn't be as large as, again, as later woodland and Mississippian trade routes, but it was still significantly large, and it was often revolved around stone trade, but especially copper, because we found copper bands, like for example in Georgia, in archaic sites in Georgia, that have been sourced to the Great Lakes, because the Great Lakes are the largest source of copper in the U.S. In fact, there are sites and cultures in the Great Lakes called the Great Lake Copper Culture from around the Archaic period, who used copper in hunting for points. I will link a video to an archaeologist who is talking about that in the iCard. So we begin to see this trade network of copper from the Great Lakes, from Georgia, from as far northeast as Newfoundland and New England. So these people were participating in trade. They were participating in art. They were participating in early sedentary societies. And of course, that in itself eventually led to the Woodland Period. Now, the Woodland Period is where we begin to see agriculture begin to be developed. And alongside that, we begin to see large ceremonial sites, which are the hallmark of the time. And from that, we can see in the bottom of this slide, you can see on the right a picture of what are called Hopewell Mounds, and from the Hopewell culture of Ohio, and then a drawing of what the Hopewell Mounds would have looked like at the time, with a wall around it. And then on top, we have from the contemporary Swift Creek culture of Georgia, a drawing of a site in Georgia called Kolomoki, which was a large Swift Creek culture site at the time. And then we have a picture of what it looks like now. So we see these ceremonial sites begin to develop, and from them we get large connected areas of societies and cultural regions. The Ohio Hopewell culture and the Swift Creek culture of Georgia and Alabama and Florida that I alluded to earlier, the Point Peninsula culture up in New York and Canada, etc., etc. So you have this large swath of cultural connection and religious connection begin to appear, and it leads to a huge, I don't want to say cultural awakening, but it leads to a civilization increase at the time. And all that has to do with the development of large permanent societies, which in turn happens because of agriculture. Agriculture allowed people to live in one place for a much longer time, and allowed for a lot more people to live in that place. So it allowed for a population boom. Now, it should also be noted that this allowed, health problems like disease, something that we are well aware of from these past couple of years on how more people can help spread disease. And then things like cavities, because oftentimes focusing on one crop, such as corn, which is high in starch and sugars, can lead to dental problems, and then obesity, which was still rare at the time, but still could happen. But even that being aside, it still allowed for these large societies to grow, and because of that, that's where we get these Hopewell and Swift Creek cultures. So how advanced were these cultures? Well, they were advanced enough to have a rather large trade network, and you can see some of the items that they would get here. Mica from the Carolinas and Georgia, quartz from Tennessee, Alabama, and Georgia, marine shells from the Gulf of Mexico, and even obsidian from as far west as Yellowstone. Now, there's some debate about whether or not the obsidian from Yellowstone came from religious pilgrimages to the area rather than trade. But again, it's the exception to the rule, as most of these items came via this Hopewell interaction sphere. Like even the bear teeth from Colorado. So, and again, the copper, which is a common theme from the Great Lakes. So, very vast trade network thanks to this very complex cultural, complex shared culture and civilization. And because of that, they developed beautiful pieces of art. Some of them were in pottery, like the Swift Creek stamp pottery on the right and the Cartersville Czech stamp pottery on the left. So they developed more pottery, and that's because they need more storage methods for their vegetables, but also you like a pretty pot occasionally. There's a variety of reasons. So the hallmarks of a much more sedentary civilization. But also they had really sophisticated art, like the copper ring in the middle of this picture, and these stone pipes, but also the claw figure that shows up here and also showed up on the trade map, which is very interesting because what it is a very thin sheet of mica, which is a mineral that if you ever pick up in a field, like in a rock quarry or something, you can tear apart like paper. It's very fragile, but it was carved into this eagle claw, which is not impossible. People have replicated it, but it's still amazing that they were able to do that. A very beautiful piece of art. And then they also had new technologies begin to develop. They had new points that were even more aimed at killing small animals like birds and birds occasionally. I should say that because oftentimes birds weren't meaty enough, but I'll still add them in there. Rabbit, deer, etc. And so you get to see these things like the Swift Creek quarter notch point in the bottom right, the Baker's Creek point on the top, and then the Benton point on the bottom left. These were oftentimes part of atlatl darts because they were too big, but again, atlatls were still around. However, something else that began to develop at the time was the bow. Now, it should be noted that the middle woodland period was roughly 400 CE, 400, 500 CE to about 500 400 BCE to 500 CE, or 400 BC to 500 AD, for those of you who aren't familiar with that measurement scale. Which, if you do the math at the time, bows had already existed for thousands of years in Africa, Asia, and Europe. Now, that does not, and I want to stress this, that does not make them less advanced in those regions, because again, the atlatl was very good at its job, and even when the Spanish and French and British came across it, they often feared the atlatl because it was more accurate than their muskets. So it was not any less advanced. It did not make them any less advanced. However, what did lead, or at least in my mind, lead to bows being adopted is it's at least a little bit quicker to fire off a few arrows at once rather than having to notch a atlatl dart and throw it and then repeat process. Again, I'm not sure how much of a time difference that is. I'm sure there could be tests, and I could be wrong, but this was still a technological development that began to happen at the time. But that being said, eventually the woodland period and the development of agriculture led into a much more advanced cultural period. And again, advanced for the time. I don't want to even remotely take away from how advanced these previous cultures were. But, again, with the development of more permanent societies and agriculture, eventually what is called the Mississippian period began to happen. And it started with roughly in the St. Louis, Missouri, and Illinois area, with Cahokia being built around 800 and 900 CE or 80, again, depending on what time scale you want to use. And it eventually grew to about 40,000 people, which was larger than London at the time. So again, not a primitive culture at all. And so from the development of Cahokia, Mississippian culture began to spread, whether intentionally or unintentionally, rapidly across the eastern woodlands, especially the southeastern woodlands. And that's where we see in the middle, and the second largest city north of Mexico, the first being Cahokia, Mountainville, located in Alabama, and then Little Egypt, which is the capital of the Coosa chiefdom of the 1400s and 1500s, which used to be located in Dalton, Georgia, but was excavated as much as possible before a dam called Carter's Lake was built in the 70s, and it was located in Dalton, Georgia, was also built, and it was also very large. So you get to see these large cities, or at least, large towns beginning to be developed. And they develop into these, again, these similar shared cultural zones, like the Hopewell culture, like the southern Appalachian Mississippi cultures, where Etowah and Moundville that I mentioned earlier resided. Cahokia was further west, and they had the middle Mississippi, and then the Conowin, Mississippi, where they're the ancestors of the Chickasaw and Choctaw, I believe. Again, apologies to any members of the tribe for any mistakes or misrepresentation I just said, but they are the ancestors of modern Indians, and this is where we get another very important city called Spiro was built, which is also a very important religious center. So you see these cities begin to bloom. However, this does not mean that they developed all the same. In fact, one archaeological study found that while Moundville and Cahokia were built along a communal, cooperative cooperative plan, Etowah was built on a more individualistic plan. So there were definite regional differences, and I may have slightly misspoke on that a little bit, but I'll source the archaeological study in the comments later. But the point is, they were developed for very different reasons oftentimes, and they even warred together and warred against each other. In fact, a later wall that was built around Etowah, dated to around the late 1300s, early 1400s, may have been because of wars and conflicts with Moundville, which is based on archaeological evidence. So they did war against each other, but they also warred against enemy tribes. But that being said, they began to develop, these large societies that were highly socially stratified. They had chiefs, like I alluded to earlier. They had these areas often were called chiefdoms, where a paramount chief, similar to a king, or at least a first among equals, would rule over, or at least hold authority over, other cities in city-states. The Coosa chiefdom and the Tuscaloosa chiefdom are two examples I'll speak on later. And they, like I said, they had chiefs. Oftentimes they had a white chief who was the leader of the political makeup of of Mississippian city. In essence, they did the administrative duties, and then there was a war chief who led the war parties and was in charge of the military. And they had priests, and they had everything like that. And they also participated in the largest trade network of the groups I've mentioned. You can see on this map they had trade as far north as New England, as far west as the Southwest and Chaco Canyon, and as far south as Mexico, and even indirectly as far south as Peru and and Mesoamerica. Again, not directly. These is probably just like somebody trades an object from the Chimu or other Indian empire at the time, and then they trade it to somebody who eventually goes to, say, the Toltec, and they trade it there, and et cetera, et cetera. So it's not one-on-one trade, but it's still a very vast trade network. And again, very large. And by the way, anybody who's ever read Guns, Germs, and Steel or seen his documentaries, this map right here and the other maps disprove a lot of his theories, because he in his books talks about how supposedly trade is easier east to west versus north to south, and that's why Europe and Asia were able to become more technologically advanced than Africa and the Americas, which I know doesn't make sense at all. And in fact, if you look at a map of the US and China, they're of a similar width. So, of course, why wouldn't trade east to west happen in the US? And also, again, you see that trade north to south did happen very easily. In fact, it happened in a similar way in Asia and Africa. And then they also had very advanced pieces of art. I mean, they had they carved images of what's called a bird dance out of copper, and there's some evidence that this was had some degree of contact with Mesoamerica, as we've seen in the map. So this may have been some cultural exchange. However, I will say this: there are some pseudo-historians and pseudo-archaeologists who have claimed in the past that supposedly when the Maya civilization collapsed, they came here and built this civilization. Doesn't make sense. There's no evidence for it. In fact, as we've seen, mounds go back a lot further. Many of them before the Maya even collapsed as a civilization, and even then, that's an oversimplification, because while some cities collapsed, some flourished. But anyways, this is also a very widespread image because it goes as far south as Mexico, but it also goes as far north as Canada. So, so what? It's just a shared cultural thing, and it's an amazing piece of art carved of copper that likely came from the Great Lakes. And then we also have two objects. You can't really see the second one very well in the picture, but two objects that are carved in the shape of kneeling individuals that were found at Etowah Mounds in Georgia in a pit. We don't really know what they were for. I mean, yes, they could have been the ever popular religious ceremony, but they could have been, who knows? They could have been representing two heroes who had fallen. They could have been some sort of I'll use, for the lack of a better term, play. They could have been part of a play. Who knows? They could have been anything. We don't know, because there were really only two of them found. There may have been more found at other Mississippian sites. I just am not aware of them. But these two, while we don't know what they are, they're still amazingly carved pieces of art. And then to the right, we have a wooden gorget from Etowah Mounds. And it's, common among all Mississippian sites, where they would carve religious symbols, mythological symbols, what have you, into either wood or bone, and wear them and whatever. Very beautiful pieces of art. So they had art that I would argue is just as amazing and sophisticated as anything in Renaissance Europe and Ming Dynasty China and Song Dynasty China, or what have you, which are all contemporary with the Mississippian period. And they also had very advanced weapons. I mean, they had very beautifully carved and very practical stone axes that you see in the far right, but they also had copper axes made from copper from the Great Lakes and other regions that, you know, were likely used as religious tools, of course, but, you know, maybe they were used in battle, but generally they were more used for religion and ceremony, because copper is not as hard as stone. I mean, it can be, but it's like sometimes it's like, for example, obsidian is sharper than surgical instruments, but surgical instruments can last longer. So why the hell would you use something that, yeah, cuts good, it cuts better for maybe one or two tries, but then breaks, versus one that, you know, lasts forever. And that's essentially what this was. Yeah, it can cut good a couple of times, but generally copper won't last as long as a stone axe. And that doesn't make them any less advanced. In fact, far from it. They had, you know, very good weapons that they made from stone and wood. You see right here, ceremonial daggers and blades, oftentimes used in sports and other ceremonies, from Etowah mounds. But then you have a stone axe or Warclub, and then you have a Warclub that sort of looks like a scimitar or falchion or whatever you want to call it from Europe. And in fact, the De Soto and Tristan de Luna expeditions talk about how the various chiefdoms that they came across, occasionally they would have warriors give demonstrations with these war clubs, and they equated the skill that, you know, these warriors used their weapons in, and how they wielded them, and the dances they used, and the forms, and etc., to sword masters in Europe. So these were very skilled warriors, very effective weapons, and in fact, they feared them in single combat. And so here we have, you know, the chief, because again, you have two chiefs who would help either political issues, logistical issues, and then also war, because war chiefs would, you know, be called to war, and they could gather several hundred to several thousand fighters, and they actually, you know, tend to prefer, rather than say battle lines where like 10,000 people march on another army of 10,000 people, they preferred warrior, you know, to use tactics based off of animals that ambush, like cougars, serpents, falcons, eagles, what have you. You know, and all of that was still based within a very hierarchical and socially stratified society, as we can see here with a chief who's holding, you know, a ceremony with two of his attendants. And then again, here we see the comparison of warriors. We have actually a picture of De Soto in his full armor, and a Mississippian warrior in armor of the time. Now, yes, sometimes Mississippian warriors did lose to Spaniards. An example of that is when warriors from the Tuscaloosa chiefdom ambushed the De Soto parties that were coming through Alabama, and they lost roughly 2,000 people to only a few, you know, dozen of De Sotos. That being said, that wasn't always the case, because again, they were just as skilled in how they use their weapons as European sword masters and as the Spaniards themselves. And in fact, there are accounts of two warriors who were captured who were able to escape and picked up Spanish weapons like swords and you know, spears, and even a fire poker, and were able to use them just as well as their war clubs, and were able to escape. And then, in fact, even a later Spanish expedition under Juan Pardo into the Carolinas, after he built several forts there, eventually the Joara chiefdom rose up and massacred all of the forts, with the exception of one, whom they sent on east as sort of a warning, like, hey, don't come back here. So no, they did very much defeat Spaniards in battle. oftentimes, you still lose battles, but then also win battles at the same time. So very comparable, at least for the time. And again, yes, the Spanish had muskets, but the atlatls and bows were feared for their accuracy. In fact, sometimes Spanish armor couldn't stand up to the longbows of these chieftains. And so, like I said, these, as I mentioned, eventually the Spanish, after the discovery of the Americas by Columbus, and I say discovery loosely, because he actually only discovered, Puerto Rico and such, and the Bahamas, but still, after the discovery of the Americas, and the conquest, again loosely, of the Aztec and Inca empires, who also put up very good fights and were not at all primitive. Spanish expeditions under De Soto, Juan Pardo, Tristan de Luna began to explore. Of course, the longest was De Soto, which you see in the right, where he came through Florida and Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, Tennessee, Georgia again, Alabama, all the way, through Arkansas, Kansas, and Texas and such. And he never actually made it back. He actually died halfway through, and it wasn't always a great time. But, unfortunately, because of these expeditions, these chiefdoms did begin to decline, and it wasn't because of Spanish conquest. It had basically everything to do with disease. Smallpox and other diseases began to ravage through the native populations, and as my mentor, Dr. Jim Langford, puts it, it was sort of an apocalypse, and I'll link his videos on the subject in the iCard, because he can describe this in a much more eloquent way than I ever could, and with much more detail. But it still was an apocalypse that began to happen, unfortunately. So these civilizations began to collapse, and eventually their descendants became what we know is the Creek and the Choctaw and Chickasaw and other Muskegon speaking peoples. So that's something to remember. They did not go away. And then even other civilizations began to benefit from it. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy in the north, who I believe there is some evidence that the cultures did war a little bit, though I could be wrong, but also the Cherokee, the Yamasee, etc., actually began to benefit from this vacuum, as often happens when when powerhouses begin to collapse. So I want that to be taken away, is that these cultures were not primitive before Christopher Columbus and the Spanish came here. They were far from it. They were incredibly advanced, and they did not become primitive afterwards either. Just because these civilizations fell doesn't mean anything, because yes, sometimes civilizations fell, but oftentimes their legacy stays behind, and that is what happened with the Creek Confederacies, Cherokee Confederacies, the Choctaw, etc. They still kept that, and they still had the same technology, and then of course began to advance with the times. So, and I recommend you do your own research. Like I said, I'll have sources in the comments. So, happy Indigenous Peoples Day. I hope you enjoyed the video. Please like and subscribe and share. And if you want me to cover, as always, any of these subjects in more detail, or any of these areas in more detail, let me know in the comments. And thank you for watching.